Harry, in the First Thessalonians, we discover that there are really kind of two descriptions of the second coming and two sets of questions that are being asked and answered. Here, too, at the beginning of chapter 2 of Second Thessalonians, Paul gives a different description, a somewhat different description of what Christians are to expect at the end of time. The coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and being gathered together to him, we beg you not to be quickly shaken or alarmed. And then he goes in to talk about rebellions, lawlessness. What's going on?
Right. So as you say, we have a second eschatological reflection going on here, which in some ways mirrors the structure of First Thessalonians, right? We had the coming to meet Jesus in the air passage, and then the thief in the night passage, doing two different bits of business.
Quite differently, right.
And so you have a similar kind of balance here. Last time we saw the image of eschatological judgment in chapter 1 with the emphasis on punishing the wicked and all of that. Yeah. And here in chapter 2, we have a kind of scenario or formula for delay.
Right, okay.
So just as in chapter 1, in First Thessalonians rather, you had the don't try to calculate the time.
Yeah.
Here it's really don't try to calculate the time because it's going to be a long way off.
Yes.
So and the whole structure of these two chapters, 1 and 2 in Thessalonians, looks an awful lot like chapters 4 and 5 in First Thessalonians. With some exhortation and then eschatology and then some exhortation. A lot less exhortation, but it's there. We have this image of the eschaton that involves some delaying factors that have caused all sorts of consternation. Where are they coming from and how exactly do they work?
Yeah, and I would love your wisdom on that.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's clear that I think the author here, whoever he is, Paul or pseudo-Paul, knows and is referring back to the scenario in 1 Thessalonians 4, the being gathered together. That was really what that was all about, being gathered together, right? But he says that's not going to be happening soon. And some people among you think that it will be happening soon, or maybe has already happened.
Yeah.
That seems to be the issue addressed in chapter 2, verse 2.
Where do they get that impression that it's already happened?
Well, there are different ways of reading this. This could suggest something like the position of the opponents Hymenaeus and Philetus in 2 Timothy, who believe that the resurrection has already occurred.
Yeah.
And I think this is one way of dealing with the problem of the delay of the parousia. Right? If a lot of early Christians expected Jesus to be coming back soon, and that didn't happen, and people were dying, and wars and rumors of wars, etc., were moving things along, how do you deal with that? One way is to give a different interpretation of what death and resurrection and the coming of Jesus might mean, to spiritualize it in some way, to talk about the presence of God as the second coming. Something like that may be going on, but I'm not so sure. All right. Another alternative is that the day of the Lord is already here. It really refers to its imminence, not its presence.
Right here.
It's coming right around the corner. And one could certainly draw an inference to that effect from Paul's scenario in 1 Thessalonians 4. It's we who are alive that will be gathered up to meet him in the air. And that conforms, as we said when we were talking about that passage, to the expectation of a lot of early Christians that, yes, indeed, the second coming is going to be happening soon. So our author here is saying, no, not only can't you tell the time, but you can tell that it's going to be a long way away.
Right.
And this is another way of dealing with the delay of the parousia that we find in some other early Christian sources. Luke's version, for instance, of the eschatological discourse in Mark 13, which can be read as a hope of an imminent coming, which Mark gives voice to elsewhere, Mark 9:1. There's some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom coming in power. Luke, taking Mark's eschatological discourse, inserts stuff between the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the coming of the Son of Man, and says this is the time of the Gentiles. So that extends the eschatological horizon. And I think what we have going on here is a similar move. you're inserting things into the tableau of end-time events that have to take place before the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
And what exactly these things are is a little bit murky, right? There's, first of all, in verse 3, a rebellion is the way the end.
Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first.
And the
lawless one.
So rebellion first, and then the lawless one is revealed, one destined for destruction.
Yeah.
So, first of all, on rebellion. The word, as it's translated here in the NRSV, sounds very political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Political, military.
Yeah.
And sure enough, there are passages in apocalyptic and eschatological discourses that talk about wars and rumors of wars.
Yeah, right.
You get that in the Markan discourse and also in Matthew. And similar kind of message, wars and rumors of wars aren't necessarily the end.
Right.
And,
right. The end is not yet. Yeah.
So rebellion could point in that direction to something political. But the word used here for rebellion in Greek is apostasia, which is the word from which we get apostasy.
Right.
And we do have some other early Christian texts that talk about things that are going to happen in the life of the church before the end.
Right.
1 John, for instance,
that
talks about people rebelling
or
against
the truth.
standing away. And it's aphistemi, which is the same root. So sometimes this verse is translated apostasy rather than rebellion and refers not to a set of political circumstances, but to dissension within the church, the like of which we get in 1 John.
Right.
Either way, it's pretty vague.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Something nasty of a rebellious sort, either political or religious, is going to happen.
Yeah.
And then someone else comes along. The lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. So then the question is, who's the lawless one?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is another vague expression for a set of characters or images that are common in or appear in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament traditions of apocalyptic expectation. We have the day star, son of dawn in Isaiah, who there's probably a mythical play going on here, maybe going back to old Canaanite myth about Baal trying to put himself in the place of the high god, Elyon. In any case, the day star, son of dawn, tries to put himself in a position of authority and take over, and he's cut down and thrown away. Or the king of Tyre in Ezekiel is another such figure that stands in opposition to God, makes himself divine or semi-divine, and is going to get cut down in the end. The best example probably is Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, the villain of the book of Daniel, the actual Greek Seleucid king who tries to oppress the people of Israel and cut off service in the temple and all of that until he's cut down or until the persecution ends. And Daniel, the book of Daniel, uses images from Isaiah and Ezekiel in order to portray Antiochus as something of a cosmic figure who's doing the same sorts of things that are attributed to the lawless one here. Putting himself above every god and making himself an object of worship, so he is taking his seat in the temple of God. Things close to that are said about Antiochus. So all of these images of opponents of God and God's people in the biblical tradition probably lurk behind this image of the lawless one. And we certainly have the book of Revelation, which conjures up images of combat of Satan on high, who's thrown down by the archangel Michael and sort of, in effect, incarnates himself in the Roman Empire and their local supporters.
Right.
So that could also be part of this imagery. One interesting little possibility here is that this is kind of an interpretation of Mark 13 and the prophecy that the abomination that makes desolate, which is an image taken from Daniel, would be seen in the temple of Jerusalem. Right? Wherever that comes from, it could be interpreted in various ways. One of the ways it could be interpreted is in political terms, when Titus, the Roman general, son of Vespasian, future Roman emperor, is there at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, he stands in the ruins of the temple. He is an abominated person who makes the temple desolate. There might be, if not a reference specifically to Titus, a reference to some Roman political authority here in this lawless one. In any case, it's vague, and it says something that you all who've read your Bible would recognize is going to happen before Christ comes again. And it's going to be someone who makes himself divine in some way or other. Paul says, or pseudo-Paul says in verse 5, "Do you not remember that I told you these things when I was still with you?"
Yeah. Probably not. Right.
Probably not. No. There's no
it's a way of
no indication in 1 Thessalonians there's anything like this going on at all. So this is another reason I think for.
So I was going to just quickly on a side on that. Does this suggest that the parousia, the coming, has been delayed further than it was? Does this sound like later in the century? In other words,
it does to me. Yeah. And these parallels that we're now finding, we saw parallels to Matthew's eschatology in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we find parallels, I guess, in places like 1 John, and we're going to see how this works out in a minute, where you have the language of the Antichrist.
Yeah.
We don't have language of Antichrist here, but the imagery that's used here of this lawless one destined for destruction is often used in Christian tradition of the Antichrist, someone who's going to oppose the divine will at the end of time. That term is used in 1 John, but of apparently, at least in very close relationship to people who are denying the truth of the gospel as that preacher tells it.
Right.
And as the imagery plays itself out here in verses 8 through 12, it seems to point in the direction of ecclesiastical division rather than political division.
Very interesting. Yep. Wicked deception.
Wicked deception, refusing
to love the truth. That doesn't sound just like the...
Right, so that's not the Emperor Titus, that's some opposing teacher. So the same kinds of moves that are being made late in the first century and using apocalyptic language to do one thing or another, I think are made here.
Yeah.
So this is another indication. I think it's a little later than Paul's time.
No, very interesting. So Satan's there again.
Yeah, and before we get to Satan, we also have this other mysterious business, something that restrains the lawless one. And what's that?
And that is what, sir?
All of these images are so vague and evocative. And to try to make some sense of it, you're going to go to mythological traditions or traditions of imagery. And you might think of what you get in the book of Revelation, chapter 12 in particular, where you have the battle between Satan and the archangel Michael, and Satan is cast down from heaven. And we've already mentioned this, and bound, but he's restrained, but he's going to come back. He's going to come back, and in the meantime, he's present in these other political forces. So something like that. A restraining power might be, the angelic forces that stand in opposition to Satan and his minions. That the author is using vague and evocative language. I think he recognizes in verse 7 the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. And this then provides the sequence into the reference to what's going on within the church.
Yeah, okay, very helpful.
Yeah, and what's going on in the church here doesn't map very neatly onto what's going on in 1 Thessalonians. Right?
It does not.
Yeah,
it does not.
You don't seem to have a doctrinal
it does not.
Matter. You don't have people separating over issues of how to define the faith. You have people worried about...
whatever this is, evocative, it is kind of code. You have a feeling you're supposed to be able to fill in the blanks. I don't think there are blanks in the same way in 1 Thessalonians.
No, it's a little more straightforward.
It's a little more, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.